Most of you haven't even been born then, but if you're older, the people on the front row remember that the astronauts landed on the moon, and they collected samples of different things, and they collected a lot of rocks because the scientists wanted to find out what the moon was made out of. So they came back, that first group, and they brought a bunch of rocks, and they studied them, and they actually had gathered more rocks than they really needed. So it occurred to somebody high in the government, hey, here's a opportunity to build goodwill. So President Nixon was president back then, and they prepared little rocks from the moon and with a plaque, and they gave 135 friendly countries a plaque with a little rock from the moon encased in plastic, and a certification by President Nixon that it was a rock from the surface of the moon. Well, then the astronauts kept on landing on the moon. More astronauts went, more rocks were brought back, and the rocks got sort of valuable, and needless to say, you remember corruption was an opportunity. People saw the opportunity, and suddenly people started selling. There got to be a market for moon rocks. People were selling moon rocks all over the United States. They would put an ad in the paper, I got a moon rock, don't you want to buy it? And people were dumb enough to buy it. You know, you could get any rock, anywhere, and say, hey, this is a moon rock. And don't you want to buy it? So it got to be so bad that the prosecutors that were investigating corruption, and so this thing is getting terrible, we got to stop it. So they set up a sting operation, and they started putting ads in the papers, we will buy moon rocks. And the idea was they were going to stop this scam of fictitious moon rocks, of fake moon rocks. Well, they did, except for one thing. One guy answered the ad, and he said, I've got a real moon, I can prove it's a real moon rock. And they said, how do you prove it? And he said, well, I got a certificate. Besides that, I sent it to Harvard, and I had this at Harvard give me a certificate that it's a real moon rock, and he actually had done this. And the investigator said, how can that be? You know, did one of the astronauts filter rock and put it in circulation? We got to find out. So this guy was really smart. He said he wanted $5 million for his moon rock, and he demanded. He had acquired it for only $35,000. He contracted to pay $50,000 for it, but being a crook, he only paid $35,000 for it. And so finally, they finally talked to the guy and convinced him that they were people, that was a rich man that wanted a collection, and his collection, he would give the guy $5 million. So he finally shows up with his rock and his plaque, and they got him. They arrested him. It results that a colonel in the Honduran army, under the military government back in the 1980s, when the military government ended, the colonel went off with the rock and the plaque and took it with him. And somehow he met this rich guy who was out to make a buck, and told, hey, I got a moon rock. And the guy said, oh, wow, that could be valuable. The light went on, that could be valuable. I got to get that. So he made the deal with him. He bought it. They offered him $50,000. He paid him $35,000. He went to Miami with the rock, and the feds got him. And then the case went to court because the guy said it was a legitimate deal. I bought it. It's a free enterprise. The guy offered me the rock in Honduras, and I paid him for it, and I brought it back to Miami. It's my rock. Who else owns the moon? But the government of the United States had to bring a case, and it was a very unusual case in the law, because the defendant in the case was the rock. It said the United States versus the moon rock. And you know, you guys think about justice being slow. It took 5 years, 5 long years to adjudicate that case and rule in favor of the rock. And the time that the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the moon rock was the property of the government of Honduras, they sent it back to NASA, they shined it up, cleaned it up, redid the plaque, and so that, well, we'll skip that one. And this is returning the stolen piece of the moon to the Honduran government, one of the officials. This is, to give you an idea of the size of the rock, it was about 1.5 inches long by about half an inch wide. It was a tiny little thing, but it took 5 years to return it. So you can see by this that from manure to the moon, corruption is rampant everywhere we go. Corruption is nature's way of restoring our faith in democracy, said Houston. But Daniel said they could find no corruption in him because he was trusted and neither corrupt nor negligent. This was about negligence. Pagayin kayo ng Diyos. God bless the Philippines. God bless you. Thank you. Mabuhay. Salamat.
We ask Honorable Winsberry to stay on the podium, sir, because we could entertain a question or two coming from the audience. Please approach or get from me the mic. I will give it to you. Identify your name and the college where you come from. Again, we can entertain a question or two coming from the audience.
Good afternoon. I'm Wilhelmina Orozco, doctoral graduate of education from the University of the Philippines. I come here as a guest, and I enjoyed your talk, sir. And I would like to say that this is a very fulfilling afternoon for me in looking at corruption. However, I would like to ask, a person or an individual may be corrupt, but we would like to look at it from a historical viewpoint, that corruption cannot be something innate to the person, but rather he or she is a product of a society in a particular historical period. And so I would like to ask, in what period in Georgian history was there a lot of corruption cases? And what particular historical events necessitated the spawning of this corrupt consciousness?
Okay, if I understand the question, what period in Georgia history was there more corruption?
Yeah, because you mentioned there are several cases, and what I would like to know, I'm interested in the historical placement of these corruption cases. For example, in my country, there was corruption during the whole 9 years of GMA rule, and so we can say that she's a product of having assumed a fake presidency. And so all her work, all her tasks were geared towards protection of her seat. And so she had to bribe people to retain herself on her seat. So there was a series of corruption cases during that time. In the same way, I would like to look that in Georgia, this corruption did not arise just because of an individual's penchant for greed. No? But am I understood? Am I clear on that?
Let me answer. I'm going to answer your question a little differently from what you expect, I'm afraid. I think corruption arose in Georgia